Hello there, this is Roberto Matthews with another tutorial for you. This is coming as an answer to a user's or a subscriber's question: how do I get MIDI working with my Magic Visualizer? If you don't know anything about the Magic Visualizer, I'm hoping to do more tutorials about it, but this is a great way to make some visuals of your music. It does audio, and it does, if you buy the full version, the MIDI. For free, you can do audio, but I digress. Let's go on to the tutorial. So the first thing you're going to need, obviously, is some MIDI. To get the MIDI, I'm using Logic Pro, but you can use just about any type of linear editor or, sequencer. What you want to be able to do is be able to export each line of your, no matter how complicated or simple it is. If it's only one line, it makes it simpler. But in this case, I have 3 lines that I have set up. So for instance, this sounds like this. Okay, so we're not going to listen to the whole thing, but that's the idea. I have a piano, I have a bass, and I have some strings coming in, basically just the violins. So in order for this to all to work, you want to export each and every one of these as its own MIDI file so that the Magics can do something separately with each one. And then you want to export an audio version of this so that you can actually hear it, because there is no sequencer here in Magix. So you won't, if you only load the MIDI, you won't hear anything. So you need to actually create or break down or bounce a audio version of this also. Okay, so here we have the piano MIDI, the bass MIDI, and the strings MIDI. And we also have our bounce, our Magic Visualizer MIDI. I'm sorry, here's the bounce right here. The Magic Visualizer project, MP3. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and load the files. So we're going to click Add Files. We have our project MIDI right here. That's the audio. Then we're going to also add the piano MIDI. Then we're going to add the bass MIDI. And we're going to add the strings MIDI. Now everything is loaded at the same time, and it's going to actually start at the same time. So we can verify that by just playing through it. Very good. And of course, if you needed to do some sort of changing of when it starts or anything like that, you can do that by right-clicking on this bar here. And you can change your start time just in case you have some syncing issues. But if you exported everything properly, you should be able to have everything synced correctly. So, of course, there's a bazillion things you can do with this Magic Visualizer. And when I say a bazillion, I'm not exaggerating too much. I'm not being too hyperbolic, because when we, for example, right click here and say add, you have all these colors you can add, all these effects you can add, you have layers, you have media that you can add, all kinds of things you can add. Some blur, you could generate your own bars, all kinds of things. And all of these different effects can be affected by your MIDI and your audio. But to keep things simple, just to get your feet wet, I'm going to just pull up something very, very simple. We're going to add a geometry, and we're going to add a polygon. Okay, and this polygon, we're going to give it, let's say, about 65 sides to make a circle. And then we're going to size our circle. And if you're having trouble finding something or not quite sure, you can also search for it. So we can go here and say scale. Okay, and we're going to scale all so that we can just do just like that. Okay, and then we're going to translate it. So we're going to go to our transform, which is where scale was, and we're going to translate, which means to move. We're going to move it by the X factor just right here. Okay, And that's basically how we're going to get started. As you can see, it's a chain. You have your polygon, which goes to what you can do to your polygon and how you can translate your polygon. So we can actually mute the scale and only have the translate right here. So this is the translate actually working. That's how I like to debug anything that I have an issue with. So I can actually just go all the way down. Now, if I click this green button, it actually will erase anything from this to the left. So as you can see, there's no more polygon because I turned off everything previous to it. Make sense? Okay, so the other thing we can do is we can highlight all three, or we can do one at a time. This short one just kind of closes it. So if your panel gets too cluttered, you can close them. So what we're going to do is we're going to create 3 of these circles to correspond to one for the piano, one for the bass, and one for the strings. So all we're going to do is say copy, and then we're going to say paste. And we can just move all 3 of these like this. And then we're going to say paste again. And move all of these like this. Okay. So then we can move all of these over. And so now we have another circle, sorry, that we're going to translate over here. And then another circle that we're going to translate all the way over here. And so let's line these up just a little bit. If you're on your Mac, you can actually press the command key, and this will change very slightly instead of big like this. So let's put this back to 0 and kind of just adjust this back and forth here, and that should be just fine. Yep, I keep pressing the wrong thing here. Okay, so now we have one for the piano, the second one for the bass, and the third one for the strings. How do we know that one is going to do, which one is going to affect which one? Well, let's go ahead and change how they move depending on which one you hear. So for instance, if I say that this one, the Y, which is the up and down, instead of doing it manually like this, let's bring this back down to 0. We can actually click this little button right here, and it actually links to something. So let's go ahead and actually load up. So our first source, let's call it piano. And then our second source, let's call it bass. And our third source, let's call it strings. Okay, so our piano is going to come from the piano MIDI. Our bass is going to come from our bass MIDI. And our strings are going to come from our strings MIDI. Okay, so we have all of this all lined up. Okay, so now we can say that our Y is going to be affected by the piano, just like that. Okay, so what are we going to actually use to affect? Well, here's another thing which is awesome. We don't have to just use the velocity to affect it. We can use the note, the number, which is actually the note pressed, like A, B, C, D, but it doesn't go by A, B, C, D, E, F, G like regular notes. It goes by the numbers, or the controller change, etc., etc., etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually go by the note number, so that it's going to change depending on what note is being played. Let's go ahead and play. So then the bass came in, but nothing moved. So let's go ahead and chain these to each one of these. So let's go ahead. This is going to be bass. We're also going to exchange the note number. And of course, we can move this up to get it out of our way here. And again, we're going to do strings and change that to our note number. And let's go ahead and see what our symphony can do now. Very good. And so we have everything lined up. So now we can do some really cool things with each one of these. Let's go ahead and imagine that we're going to change the color as well as the bouncing up like it's doing. Well, not only can we change the color, but the bounce can be smoother than this. So instead of being very accurate like that, we can actually add some modifiers to how this moves. This little equal sign here tells you that you're going to add a little modifier. So if we click this here, we can add all kinds of modifiers here, and you can go crazy going through all of these. But what I'm going to do is use this one that says smooth, and it's actually going to ask me how smooth I want to make it. So we can go ahead and play around with that by just pressing here. And as you can see, it moves very smooth now. We can actually move that way up. Let's bring it back down. And so the higher the number, the slower it will move. So let's bring this back to 1.1 rather. And go ahead and press play. Very nice. Okay. Let's do the colors. So let's go ahead and add a color. So I can, if I right click up here and say add color, it's just going to add a color module just kind of outside here. And we can actually take this tag off. We can add a tag here and then click this tag here. And now the color is tied to the piano, as you can see. But instead of doing it that way, we can actually just right click anywhere on this line and say insert. And it's going to insert that color right in between there. So that works out much better. So now, for instance, we can have the hue be taken up by that note number also. And let's see what happens when we do that. So that was pretty nice. So basically, depending on the note number is how high this this hue is going to be, and you can see how it's changing it right here. Okay, very nice. So we can do that. We can do that same thing here, insert color. And we're going to use the bass instead. Do the same thing, the note number, and see what happens in this case. So as you can see, we have a problem because the numbers are since the note names are similar, the colors are very similar. So let's say we don't want to change. We want to change kind of that number more drastically. Well, we can change our modifier to be, for instance, let's say it's going to be a scale, and we're going to change the scale by a quarter, so 0.25. So instead of multiplying it by a whole one, in other words, instead of being the number that you see here, just like here, it's going to be a quarter of that number. Let's see what happens in that case. And let's fast forward here to about 6 seconds because we don't want to have to hear the whole beginning again. Now you get the idea. So now let's go ahead and do something a little bit more drastic. Let's delete all of these, everything on this page here. And let's imagine we want to do a few other things. Let's imagine that we want to, instead of adding just a simple geometry, let's add something really cool. Let's add this GLS shader, one of my favorite inserts. This actually has a whole bunch of different inserts that you can play around with, and we can just go through them all. We can go, there's a whole list, a whole mess of them right here. We can do blobs, for instance, which is pretty cool. We can do lines. So like neon lines. We can even do one of my favorite, which are clouds here. I really like clouds. And so let's go ahead and play around with the clouds. So I want several things to happen. The first thing I want is I want this speed to slow way down. Okay. And what I want is I want in the clouds, I want this brightness to kind of come up. So we're going to go ahead and see if we can find something that says brightness. So we just have to test. Let's see, bright. And let's see how bright it can get. Ah, perfect. Okay. So we want this brightness to be handled by something. Okay. Then we want, let's say the rotation. So we can maybe rotate it. No, let's not do rotate. Let's do a different translate. Let's translate the Z-axis just like that. That's perfect. Okay. And then let's also change the color. So you saw that color right there. Okay. So what we're going to do, let's change this. So if you right click on here, you can change this, replace this color. Let's replace it with an RGB. That's much better. And let's say we're going to add some green to it. Let's see. Maybe remove the red. That'll work. So our brightness is going to be modulated by our piano. Okay. So our piano is going to come out. We're going to do that note number. And let's see what happens when that plays. So you notice that it's way too bright. So let's tune that down. We tune that down with our multiplier. And let's multiply by a factor of 0.1 instead of 1 and see what happens. And let's try a little bit more until we see something change. That's perfect. Now we want our bass to affect our pulse. So note number here. Let's see what happens. Pull this down a little bit. Okay, so that's again very hot. So of course we can change all kinds of things here. There you go. And of course, we want to change our color depending on our strings. So now you have an idea of what you can do with your MIDI. And of course, you can do all kinds of things. You could bring in different shapes. You can even bring in SVGs to your visualizer and do all kinds of crazy things. So that's a nice little tutorial, a kind of start, get your toes wet, dip your toes in on how to use the visualizer with the MIDI. Make sure you always add an audio so that you can actually hear it. So for example, if I mute this audio right here, it'll still work, but you won't hear anything. Okay, so if we solo this, it doesn't do any difference because this is just for the audio part. So notice that the MIDI are the instructions, whereas the sound is basically the sound. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a wonderful day.